Hello, and welcome back to the Murakami Companion podcast, a show inspired by the works of Haruki Murakami, where we analyze his body of work in its entirety. Today, we'll be talking about The City and Its Uncertain Walls, a very interesting novel based on a short story that was published in a magazine in the 80s but never showed up in any compilation. That story became the basis for hard-boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. Yet, during the 2020 pandemic, Murakami began to write a new version of this story, which eventually turned into The City and Its Uncertain Walls, a very different book. This is a novel that is divided in three parts. Part 1 might feel like not a remake, but a complete reimagination of Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. In the beginning of Part 2, you might find some elements of Kafka on the Shore, but it goes into another direction. From now on, spoilers, and also the novel is very open to interpretation, so feel completely free to disagree with this analysis. The story is told from the perspective of a narrator, and in the beginning it feels like he's writing to a secondary character, a girl whom we only know as You. He's in love with this girl. They are teenagers, he's just a year older. Love is in the air. They both like to write. She develops a story, a fictional world, that is like a magical town in a rural setting, surrounded by a wall that protects this town or city. They talk about that place a lot between them. But she seems kinda anxious and sad. Then one day she disappears without a trace. So what happens is that by means that are yet unknown to us, our narrator goes into the fictional world, into the fictional city, with the intention of retrieving her. The protagonist arrives at the town as a whole being, but he must be separated from his shadow as a condition to pass through the front gate. His shadow will be left there to die, but that might take even months. So he leaves his shadow there, enters the town and finds the girl. She's still a teen, but he's now a man in his 20s. She's working at the library and they give him a job there as a dream reader, reading dreams. We will see what this means later on. She doesn't remember him. In fact, she doesn't remember much about the outside world. She's like a ghost of her former self, and the narrator begins to turn also into a shadow of his former self the more time he spends separated from his shadow. Finally, he decides to retrieve his shadow, who is not literally a shadow, is just another version of himself, and they both try to leave town. But in the end, the protagonist lets his shadow run away and he chooses to stay in the town anyways. Because even if the version of the girl that lives in that city is just a shell of her former self, he still kind of feels that he found her, finally. So we go back to the real world, where the narrator is surprised to find himself there, as he believed that he had chosen to stay in the town and the shadow will go into the real world. So what had brought him to the real world again? Anyways, that's the end of part 1. Our narrator is back into the real world, where the girl is nowhere to be found. Also, we're never quite sure where the fictional or spiritual or mystical town really is, or how to actually get there. Part 2 takes a very different direction, where the narrator, who is now in his 40s, decides to move from Tokyo, leave his job, and take a new job in a library, in a small rural town. Where you hear this very simplified explanation, it's obvious that there's a parallel between the place he's trying to move to and the fictional town, but in the actual book, the process is so gradual that you might not notice that until later. At the same time, this town has a very similar vibe to the town that we found in the novel Kafka on the Shore, complete with a ghost, a person who dresses opposite to their birth gender, and the cameo of a crow. But that's where the parallel ends. There's a whole thing about the narrator working there, him meeting with a ghost, trying to figure out the mystery of an autistic teenager, him dating a certain character. It's a whole new story that makes him grow as a person. Still, he feels nostalgic for the girl and often dreams of going back to the mystical city surrounded by those mysterious walls. So I'm gonna go into end of the book spoilers here, so double warning. What actually happens is that the magical world and the mysterious town are places in the narrator's mind, built out of memories and imagination. In part 1, when he went there, he just went into his own head, so he meets his shadow self there. Now, the quote-unquote real him is just his consciousness, and the shadow self is just his unconscious mind, but they are the same person. They are intrinsically connected. It's just that one takes care of the outside world and the shadow's work is to deal with his inner world. The shadow is native to the world of the mind, and the conscious self, the quote-unquote real self, is native to the real world, but they are just like two pairs of eyes, one that is looking outwards and one that is looking inwards, but they are connected to the same mind. So, plot twist, at the end of part 1, when the shadow escapes and the real self decides to stay, that's what actually happens. The narrator and another character theorize that he just got outside anyways, somehow, but that's a lie. From the end of part 1, the shadow self, without knowing, has taken the memories and the life of his conscious part, of his conscious self. That's why he is trying to emulate the narrator's inner world in the outer world. That's why he moves to a town that is very similar to what his inner world is like, because he longs to be there. That's where he belongs. He's the part of himself that belongs to the realm of memories and imagination. And at the end of part 2, he goes back inside his own head, but not into the titular town where they don't like shadows, but he's just outside where he actually finally meets the girl that he was in love with in his youth. He meets her again, or at least the memories of her, but the real memories, not the shell of the girl that lives inside the town. On the other hand, in the part 3 of the book, we go back with the real self of the narrator, who is still stuck in the fictional world inside his own head, still in this magical city. Do you remember the dream reading thing? So it turns out that what this does is to receive the experience from the outside world through dreams and then freeing them in the imagination world. They are using the dream as a way for the outside world to feed the inner world. That's why the town is modeled after a story that the girl wrote about. That's why there are characters in the town that are analogs for the people he meets in the real world. In the end, the narrator's real self decides to leave this fictional town in his own mind and go back into the real world. He longs for that, because that's where he belongs. He's informed that his shadow self has been taking good care of his outer lives, and he just goes back and the story ends. So the ending is they just both independently switch places voluntarily. The shadow self goes back into the inner world and the real self goes back into the outer world. There are two very interesting things about this book. First, there is finally an explanation on how the other selves or the shadow self of the characters really work in Murakami's books. Secondly, I think the lesson here has to do with nostalgia. This is a book that is based on a short story from 40 years prior, and it already had another full novel based on it. But it takes a different direction. And that's the thing. Nostalgia isn't bad, but there's a place for that. And that place is your mind, your dreams, your imagination. But you shouldn't let nostalgia dictate your life. Outside of the book, in our actual real life, there's obviously moments where our conscious self is always looking inside, always in an introspective mood. You're always with your attention in the past, on imaginary things, on memories, and you're missing your actual real life. And the part that is supposed to be managing your inner self ends up taking the driver's seat for your life. And what that means is that the part of you that is tied to nostalgia and imagination and things that don't actually exist outside of your mind becomes a driving force behind your life if you're too deep into nostalgia and dreams. But your shadow self isn't bad, it's just filling the spot until the other you comes out of the dream. The character that we later learn that is the shadow self in the real world is very concerned about his life not moving forward. He feels like he's just waiting life to happen to him. He's stuck. And that makes sense because he's not supposed to be the driving force behind his life. He's supposed to live in a world of imagination and memories. The book is very smart about not being anti-nostalgia, but about understanding that nostalgia, memories, and imagination have a place in our lives, and that is inside. If you truly love someone at one point in your life and that person is not around anymore, it's okay to be nostalgic about it, but you can let that memory and that loss dictate your life. You can get The City and Its Uncertain Walls pretty much anywhere where good books are sold. If you want to support this podcast or you just like t-shirts, coffee mugs or art prints, we got a few digital stores where you can find all of that and more, featuring the covered artwork for this episode inspired by The City and Its Uncertain Walls. There will be one design for each episode release of this podcast.